Looking at them objectively, Cyan and Seal's talents weren't bad. In fact, they were actually excellent. Good enough to live up to their surname of Lionheart. The problem is that this year's bloodline continuation ceremony, Ancilla wasn't sure whether or not to feel dissatisfied with the contents of this year's bloodline continuation ceremony. Asking them to explore a labyrinth after entering through separate entrances? That would mean that Cyan and Seal would be unable to help each other. If it was just simple sparring, either Cyan or Seal, one of them would definitely have won. Although she could no longer be quite so sure of this. Eugene from the collateral lines had completely defeated Cyan in their duel. This fact had complicated things for Ancilla. But in a labyrinth with many variables, the outcome of their duel might not be so easily repeated. Should she be satisfied because of that? Or should she be dissatisfied that this ceremony castrated the main family's advantage and placed all the participants on an equal level from the very start? And I definitely cannot be caught interfering with the bloodline continuation ceremony. Having stressed about this problem all night, Ancilla let out a long sigh. She had thought about secretly persuading her husband to give her children an advantage, but she knew that her husband was someone who held strict expectations of his children. Pointlessly trying to push her luck like this would only lead to her receiving a disappointed look from her husband. Ancilla turned her head to the window and murmured, "I need to give them an advantage, but what?" There were only a few more days until the bloodline continuation ceremony. During this time, the participants would need to cram any information that might prove helpful in the labyrinth. As a result of this, instead of training with Hazard, Cyan and Seal were planning to dig through any labyrinth-related books they had managed to find in the capital. Although she might have slapped Cyan's cheeks out of rage, Ancilla truly loved her children. As such, she couldn't allow her children to live with the label of a concubine's child for the rest of their lives. After she had given so much just to get to this point, all the insults and disgrace I have suffered have only brought me closer to the position that I crave. Cyan and Seal were still young. The twins were able to act so recklessly and get their way within the main estate, all because Ancilla had refused to pay any attention to the insults and instead stood proudly as the second madam of the direct Lionheart line, sheltering her children in the process. That was why her son's loss had hurt so much. Getting defeated by a collateral descendant after having inherited the legitimate bloodline as a member of the direct line. Still, I'd prefer, Ancilla sighed again, a complicated look on her face. If that boy named Eugene were the first to break through the labyrinth. If that were to happen, it would lead to an unexpected stalemate. The entire main family would be forced to suffer a disgrace. But now the shame of having lost to Eugene would no longer be borne solely by Cyan and Ancilla. The patriarch, Gilead, and the first wife, Tanis, would also share in this embarrassment. On the other hand, Eugene breaking through the labyrinth could even alleviate the impact of his victory over Cyan. It would no longer mean that Cyan was lacking but that the collateral line's Eugene was suspiciously exceptional. Although the optimal outcome would be if Cyan and Seal were the ones to break through the labyrinth. Ancilla released yet another sigh and got up from her seat. If they can't do that, it would be better if the one who breaks through the maze is Eugene, rather than Ewid or any other kid. Of course, this was just a thought. Ancilla had no desire to actually cheer for Eugene. She was only thinking about the best possible results for herself and her children. The latest episodes are on underfiv.website. 4 days later, the children staying at the annex received a message from the main family. Since the preparation to summon a labyrinth into the forest had finally been completed, the message announced that the bloodline continuation ceremony would begin today and formally requested their presence at the starting location. According to the message, they were allowed to wear casual attire, but any other privately prepared items were forbidden. Then what about their weapons? Most of the children harbored such concerns, but they did what they were told and followed the knights into the forest. "I'll be preparing the weapons for you," Lovelian explained when they arrived. Both Lovelian and Gilead had been waiting for them inside the forest. Behind them stood the towering entrance to a cave that looked both suspicious and artificial upon close glance. "Just tell me what weapons you need. Although they won't last for the whole day, children, remember that you'll be fighting illusions, not real foes. You should be able to fight with them as long as your weapons retain their proper shapes. Right, children?" Lovelian said all this with a friendly smile. Eugene hated being addressed with the word children more than anything else. After all, wasn't that treating him as a kid? However, since his body was, in reality, that of a child, he couldn't openly express his dissatisfaction. Is there only one choice of weapon? Seal questioned Lovelian with a bright smile. Not at all. I can prepare whatever you need, Lovelian promised. How are you going to do that? With a smile for how cute Seal's wide-eyed look of curiosity was, Lovelian raised both hands while looking at her. Like this, he said. Whoosh. Streams of soil rose from the ground and formed clumps between Lovelian's palms. In only moments, a long sword had been shaped from these clumps of dirt. Wow! Came a collective exclamation. Seal caught the sword sent flying towards her with both hands. The weight was just right and the feel of the grip wasn't bad either. As if curious about its quality, Seal tried swinging the sword a few times. What should I do if it breaks? She asked. Little lady, you don't need to worry about that. This man in front of you is an amazing wizard. Not only was that labyrinth over there summoned by my magic, but the sword that you, little miss, are holding will never break while you're inside of the labyrinth. Apart from swords, can you make animals as well? I can make dolls and golems are also within my purview, but I can't make anything that's truly living. If that's the case, then can I go inside with a golem you've created? Visit. For the best experience. That's quite the cunning idea. Lovelian burst out laughing and turned to look at Gilead. Gilead, who was smiling at his daughter's request, slowly shook his head. Gilead denied her request. We can't have you doing that. Won't that just be the golem fighting instead of you? Then please make me a doll next time, Seal begged with a wide smile. Uad's eyes were shining as he looked at the light covering Lovelian's hand. Why can't you create anything living? He asked abruptly. Lovelian turned to look at Uad, who had a fascinated expression on his face at this question. That's because it's a taboo of magic, Lovelian explained. A taboo? Not only is true life difficult to make, but there's also nothing good to be had from making it. Giving birth to a living creature is a beautiful miracle of existence, and not so easily replicated. Uad nodded his head as if he understood what Lovelian was trying to say. Mister, I don't want this one. Could I get a sword that's a little longer and a lot thinner, please? Seal interrupted their impromptu lesson. Now, please hold on a moment. While I can make a weapon for everyone individually, it will be difficult for me if I have to keep changing the sword bit by bit so that it looks exactly like how you envision it in your head, young lady. Lovelian held a hand up to Seal. Then a bright strand of light shot over to her from his hand. As such, young lady, why don't I allow you to sculpt it yourself? That goes for the rest of you children as well. It isn't difficult. After all, I'll be casting the magic, so all everyone else needs to do is to clearly picture in their head what type of weapon that they want and then touch the light. Strands of light shot out and connected to each of the 9 children. Uad's fingertips trembled as he looked at the light with ecstatic eyes. Whoa! Gargith exclaimed. He had envisioned the great sword that he regularly used when he was back home. Miraculously, everything was just as he remembered. Even the familiar weight had been replicated. While hanging the sword over his shoulder, he kept bursting out in admiration. Desra also made a spear that was identical to the one she used most often during training. While lingering on the feel of the spear as she held it in her hands, she thrust the spear several times into thin air. Then she hung the spear across her back with a satisfied look on her face. Seal and Cyan both made swords. Seal's sword appeared long and thin, while Cyan's sword was the same length. It looked slightly heavier. Uad made an ordinary sword. His eyes that had been shining brilliantly as he stroked the light instantly sank into their usual dim state the moment that Uad was left holding a sword instead. Although the dropouts were also making their weapons, Eugene didn't pay any attention to them. Those guys had shown no motivation on their way in. They would probably give up on the challenge as soon as they had entered the labyrinth. Eugene made a sword that fit with the length of his arm and also created a small shield to be worn on his left forearm. Why didn't you make a spear? You're good with a spear after all, Desra asked petulantly. I'm also good with a sword, Eugene replied back confidently. And what's with the shield? I'm also good with the shield. Why don't you just say that you're good with everything? Desra grumbled. Seal stared at the two of them as they shared a conversation before approaching Eugene. If we meet in the maze, what are you going to do? What do you mean, what am I going to do? Are you going to fight me? Are we allowed to fight? Eugene turned to Gilead and asked. There's nothing to stop you, since the purpose of the bloodline continuation ceremony is competition, Gilead replied with a grin. At these words, Seal puffed up her cheeks. However, we don't absolutely need to fight, Seal protested. Gilead nodded, that's right. Rather than a straight competition between the participants, in this bloodline continuation ceremony, I'll be looking for the ability to make accurate judgments based on the situation and the spirit of cooperation. After all, aren't we all part of a family that shares the name Lionheart? He says that we're family, Seal said as she turned back to Eugene with a small smile. When is your birthday? September. Mine is in April. That means I'm your big sister. What be you? Shit are you spouting? Eugene was about to say that before remembering that Seal's father, Gilead, was still here. You have such a cunning tongue, Eugene complained. What do you mean? Seal asked. It's nothing, Eugene replied with a cough and turned his head away. Chapter 13. Before you enter, each of you should take one of these. After making weapons for all the children, Lovelian then took out some necklaces with blue jewels hanging from them. These necklaces will be connected to your thought patterns. If the labyrinth ends up causing you too much stress, the necklace will react and I'll know to intervene. So it was a safety device in case of emergencies. Also, if you truly feel like you won't be able to make it to the center of the labyrinth, say help me while tapping on the necklace's jewel. Then you'll be able to escape the labyrinth without any problems. Hansen and the other dropouts nodded their heads in relief at these words. They were only here to do the bare minimum needed to satisfy the family tradition. They held no grand ambitions going into the bloodline continuation ceremony. Well then, please start entering the labyrinth in an orderly manner. Having said all that was needed to be said, Lovelian smiled broadly and moved aside, leaving the entrance to the cave free. While it might seem like you're all heading in together, from the moment you all enter the cave, everyone will be led down a different path. So don't get too flustered and keep heading straight ahead, since there's only one path leading forward at the very beginning. From that point onwards, if you get the feeling that you can't go on, remember to tap the jewel. The children began to walk into the cave. Eugene strode forward, keeping the shield he had strapped onto his left forearm at the ready. Before they stepped into the cave's entrance, Seal, who was walking beside him, gave Eugene a broad smile and said, "Do your best." Garjeth and Desra silently glanced at Eugene. Eugene laughed at their gazes and said to Seal, "You too?" "All right." Seal nodded her head vigorously at the casual encouragement he had tossed her way. The 9 children all entered the cave together. The moment everyone passed through the sole entrance to the cave, their surroundings disappeared and were replaced by darkness. Someone may have cried out in surprise, but the sound wasn't carried to the others. Without the slightest bit of panic, Eugene took in his surroundings. Although he knew that he had just been transported into the maze through summoning magic, he hadn't actually felt any sense of discomfort during the process. Though it may have been that Lovelian was just that good of a wizard, living up to his title as an archwizard, it might also be because Eugene's still-growing body couldn't detect the peculiar sense of incongruity that came from having magic cast on it. Because I haven't trained my mana yet, Eugene reasoned. If that was the case, he could only rely on his body's other senses. Luckily, that was one of the areas that Eugene felt particularly confident in. Eugene took a long, slow breath. Although he wasn't particularly agitated in the first place, both his body and mind calmed down even further. Then he started focusing on his senses one by one. First sight, then hearing, smell, and finally touch. And what about taste? Taste wasn't a sense that saw much use when exploring a labyrinth. However, by slightly chewing the tip of his tongue, Eugene at least made the taste of blood linger in his mouth. Through this method, all his senses had been sharpened. Moreover, through his repeated long, slow exhalations, he had also heightened his awareness of his surroundings. The sensitive intuition aroused through this process could even be called his sixth sense. This method to heighten his awareness came from the life experience of stupid Hamel. Labyrinth explorations? He had gone through so many in his past life that he had become almost bored with them. Most of the monsters who could burrow through the ground would make their lairs into mazes. Since even a mere ant could build their nest in such a fashion, goblins and the like were definitely capable of doing the same when digging their lairs. And that wasn't even mentioning the demons. In modern times, the Devildom of Helmuth was said to have become a place where it was even possible to go on a sightseeing tour as long as you spent enough money. The Helmuth that Hamel had wandered through was a place that shouldn't be allowed to exist in this world, an unending and unrelenting hellscape. How many times had he almost died in that place? Most of the skills he had once been confident in proved useless once in Helmuth. Even that foolish Molin had been scared out of his habit of charging forward recklessly. Sienna, who exalted herself as an archwizard, couldn't even trust in her magic to keep her safe. Even Anise, who claimed that God would always take care of her, found herself calling more often on her companions instead of her God for help. Only Vermouth had remained unmoved. Eugene smiled bitterly. The hero Vermouth and his companions. That was the correct way to put it. Vermouth was always the center of the party. If it weren't for him, the rest of them would never have been able to make it into Helmuth. After all, when they first entered Helmuth, Hamel, Molin, Sienna, and Anise were all still young and inexperienced. However, they didn't stay that way. People grew through adversity. Even if it wasn't to the same extent as Vermouth, all of his companions had at one point believed in the delusion that they were the best in the world. So they were all able to show explosive growth once sufficiently challenged. After a certain point, despite still being in Helmuth, the companions began returning to their daily routine. Molin resumed charging ahead, Sienna regained trust in her magic, and Anise restored her faith in God. As for Hamel, he hated that he was weaker than Vermouth. He hated the way his body shook in fear. He began to suspect that he could never be as good as Vermouth. So he started pushing himself even more. Since he couldn't be like Vermouth, then he needed to grow stronger in his own way. Vermouth never felt fear. Hamel, on the other hand, did feel fear. So he needed to get used to the fear and overcome it. Vermouth was able to accomplish anything easily. Hamel never had it easy. Even if it seemed easy at first, he would always end up running into a wall one day. As such, he would need to break through that wall if he wanted to advance. And that went for labyrinths as well. Even when Vermouth encountered a labyrinth for the first time, he didn't panic, and after some time he found the way through. Yet despite everything, he was still a human, so he couldn't always choose the right path. Whenever Vermouth made a mistake or found the right path again, Hamel would always look for the reasons that led to Vermouth finding the right path and what mistakes led to him choosing the wrong path in the first place. Since Hamel didn't have an innate instinct for this like Vermouth did, he made up for his own shortcomings through this painstaking method. And all of this experience was retained inside Eugene's head. Eugene analyzed this labyrinth. This is a labyrinth made for children to be able to conquer it. The labyrinth isn't even designed with any intent to kill. Since that's the case, it should be blatantly simple to get through. Despite the lack of lighting, Eugene hadn't halted his steps. As Lovelian had said at the start, there could only be one way forward. His surroundings were still dark. But after progressing a certain distance, the darkness slowly began to peel back. After a while, he could start to see the walls on either side of him. The distance between them was large enough that it shouldn't be difficult to swing a weapon. However, if you wanted to swing a spear to your heart's content, you would need to keep your own positioning in mind at all times. That was why Eugene hadn't chosen a spear. Instead, he had gone for a sword and a shield. Although basic, it was actually a universal combination that would allow him to respond to almost any situation. So the ceiling is closed in, Eugene thought with an upward glance. This meant that he couldn't use the shortcut of climbing over the walls. Among the senses that he had purposefully heightened, Eugene focused on his sense of smell. With the taste of blood still lingering in his mouth, he was able to first focus on the scent of blood, and with that as a backdrop, he was able to find any foreign odors that stood out against it. Through this, he detected a slight oily scent. If he had been able to manipulate his mana, he would be able to sense it even more clearly. While feeling a little regret, Eugene pressed forward. After walking for a short while, a fork came up in the road ahead. Both of the split paths looked identical. The oily smell was coming from the path to the left. Even though it was a trap created from magic, it still gave off an oily scent. This meant it had been purposefully made easy to detect. However, Eugene still took the left path. He wanted to confirm that his judgment was correct. While pretending to walk as if he hadn't noticed anything, he was concentrating on the weight transmitted through the soles of his feet with each step. The first step, second step, third step, fourth step, and finally on the seventh step. As his foot touched the ground, it gave way slightly. And another count from here. 1, 2, 3. From. Arrows poured forth from the gaps in between the wall bricks. Without panicking, Eugene lifted his shield. Tang tang tang. The arrows couldn't pierce his shield and just bounced off. Then, without going another step further down the path, Eugene simply turned back. That was too easy, Eugene grumbled. It must have been because they had set the difficulty for a child's level. Go back to the annex and rest, Gilead said as he turned his cold gaze away from the child before him. Hansen was the first to declare that he was giving up by tapping on his necklace as soon as it was possible to do so. While thinking that he didn't stand a chance in this competition anyway, he had decided not to waste any extra effort. His parents also hadn't held any expectations that their son would choose to do anything different. Why yes. Hansen had been hanging back hesitantly as he waited for the patriarch's response to his surrender, but he quickly bowed his head and left. Sometime after he had left, another call for rescue was heard. The 10-year-old Juris had actually made it into the labyrinth, which was at least a little better than Hansen. However, he was struck by an arrow at the first trap and had started begging for help with tears pouring from his eyes. Shortly after that, yet another call for rescue came in. It was from the 11-year-old Deacon. Although he had endured being struck by an arrow, he was beaten by the slime he had encountered afterward. Slimes were monsters that were difficult to deal with when equipped only with bladed weapons. Deacon was swallowed up by the slime's gelatinous body and had started screaming for his life. Though less than an hour had passed, the 9 had shrunk down to 6. It might seem pathetic, but these results were as predicted. No one had expected to see anything special from those 3 dropouts. As for Garjith, he's clumsy but he never stops moving forward, Gilead judged objectively. Lovelian floated an image of the labyrinth's interior into the air. The image was divided into 6 screens to show each of the 6 children. Rather than avoiding the traps, Garjith had chosen to force his way through them. Even though he was struck by arrows or confronted with a monster, he would smash his way through with one swing of his greatsword, which was about as large as his torso. Gilead turned his attention to another competitor. Desra is agile and she also has a good intuition. Whenever she triggered a trap, she would change paths immediately. She had even managed to dodge through several traps. She didn't try to always fight the monsters either. If there was another path available, she would take it, and she only swung her spear when she couldn't get away in time. Cyan is being overly cautious, but that's not so bad. Ancilla had obtained the notes of famous adventurers and the blueprints of several labyrinths and had used them to train the twins. Through this, the twins had learned the basic information and strategies for conquering labyrinths, all of which would help them break through this transparent and easily explored labyrinth. For example, when the labyrinth was enclosed on all sides, but a wind was being generated by magic, then following the direction of the wind could help you find your way. If they looked carefully, they could also find several other artificial clues that pointed to the right way. And even without that, as long as they used their judgment, it was possible to escape a trap during the moment that it activated. Cyan was capable of doing just that. However, due to being overly cautious, there was some awkwardness to his movements. His mind just wasn't flexible enough. His vision was narrowed because he was trying to rely solely on what he could recall from memory. That was why there were times when he fell into an easy-to-avoid trap. Seal is sensible and her thinking is flexible. However, there is a childish side to her. Seal would activate a trap by throwing things like her shoes. After doing that a few times, she would be free to head down the now trap-free path. If her path became blocked, she would just turn around, and if her path wasn't blocked, she would just keep going. Whenever she encountered a monster, she wouldn't fight them right away and would instead harass them as if she was playing with a new toy. Eugene grinned as he recalled something. Every time he had insisted on checking out the wrong path like this, Sienna would just about have a seizure. His past life's memories had brought back not just his adventuring experience but also the various fond recollections associated with it. As Eugene felt his insides twist in longing, he returned to the fork and took the path on the right. As for Ued, how is he? Gilead asked. He seems to be very interested in the magic, Lovelian replied. Ued wasn't focusing on the sole task of breaking through the labyrinth. Instead, he examined each trap one by one, and he exclaimed in admiration every time he saw a monster. He was amazed at how lifelike they seemed despite being made from an illusion. And after defeating a monster, instead of leaving immediately, he would examine the corpse for quite some time with shining eyes. His eyes, which were dull and dead whenever he slashed at the monsters with his sword, revived with a smile whenever they touched on magic. He's been like that ever since he was young. He liked reading books better than training his body or his skills. He especially enjoyed whenever I read him a fairy tale about magic. Do you know? Uad, that child, he respects the wise Sienna more than his own ancestor, the great Vermouth, Gilead confessed. Master Sienna is someone who deserves the respect of all wizards after all. Lovelian smiled proudly. That's exactly what he said. When listening to the adventures of the hero Vermouth, he liked Sienna's stories better than those about Vermouth. He said that it was because, whenever the party was in trouble, it was Sienna's magic that could come up with the most surprising solutions for their troubles. Gilead paused before continuing to speak. That fairy tale was also read to me when I was young. But I hate to tell you the truth, I actually preferred Hamel, Gilead admitted. Are you really talking about stupid Hamel? Lovelian asked in surprise. If it wasn't for him getting into trouble, the fairy tale would have been very boring. Although he was ill-mannered, he was also good-hearted. He inspired me to slowly overcome my inferiority complex towards my ancestor Vermouth through my own hard work. Because even when everyone else was already following Vermouth's opinion, Hamel, all on his own, insisted that he had a different opinion. I actually hated Hamel when I was a kid. Well, that's fair. Thanks to Hamel, the party was forced into several crises. However, Hamel always tried to take full responsibility for his actions in each crisis. That was why I couldn't possibly hate Hamel. Gilead looked at the events occurring within the labyrinth with a smile. Uad, that child, has wanted to learn magic ever since he was young. I even invited a magic teacher from the capital just so that he could learn properly. But halfway through he refused to learn any more magic, Gilead recalled. Do you know his reasons for that? Lovelian asked. Reality forced him to give it up. For the sake of his mother. He decided that he needed to become the next Lionheart patriarch. And because magic provides no advantage in the competition for succession, he had to turn away from it. The competition over the succession would begin in earnest when all his children had become adults. Well, that's understandable. Although magic offers countless possibilities, it is still a long and difficult road to get to that point, Lovelian offered. Truthfully, I would be happy if you had chose to walk the path of wizardry. Gilead smiled sadly and turned towards Lovelian. There is only one family among the collateral lines specializing in magic. As such, I've tried to point Uad towards them a few times, but he has always refused. However, if he receives an offer to become the disciple of the head wizard of the Red Tower, he won't possibly be able to refuse. Because Uad still has a great passion for magic burning in his heart. I can't give you the answer you want right away, Lovelian shook his head. Because I can't just make anyone my disciple. Since I have a good relationship with you, Sir Gilead, I can take him with me, but if he doesn't show me that he has the qualifications for it, I won't be making him my disciple. That's not a problem. It also wasn't my intention to force you to take him in. However, I want to let that child have a chance to follow his dreams. Gilead wasn't doing this for the sake of Cyan and Seal's succession rights. It was just that seeing his eldest son rot, as Uad forced himself to do work that he hated, was painful for Gilead. To convince his first wife, Tanis, and give Uad a push on the back, he had even personally invited the head wizard of the Red Tower, Lovelian. Well, I'll just have to take a closer look at Uad's qualifications later. Right now, it seems that Uad has already decided that he won't be using any magic as he attempts to break through the labyrinth. Lovelian muttered as he looked at the screen. However, what on earth is that kid Eugene? Eugene had already caused him to feel amazement several times in a row. But by now, feelings of perplexed confusion were overtaking his sense of admiration. I don't know either, Gilead muttered in a sincere tone. On his screen, Eugene was in the middle of tearing the illusion of a troll into pieces. For there to be trolls of all things. Weren't they too much of an opponent for children in their teens? Eugene had this thought from the moment he encountered them in the labyrinth. However, on second thought, these weren't even real trolls, just an illusion created by magic. It wasn't like the children could really get hurt either. Although they might feel pain, that too was just an illusion caused by magic. If the children were able to overcome their fear, the trolls weren't an impossible opponent for them. If they could just endure the pain, dig their heels in and get in a good first blow, then they could even defeat these illusory trolls. Though they looked just like the real thing. Eugene felt admiration as he looked the troll up and down. Even though he knew that it was an illusion, he still got the feeling of facing a real troll. Not only were its movements the real deal, but it also had the disgusting body odor that was characteristic of trolls. But it looks like Lovelian and Gilead still have a conscience. Considering its size, it didn't seem to be an adult troll. Instead, it appeared to be at an age where a troll would still be dependent on their parents, lacking in the skills for hunting and fighting. They weren't even holding the clubs that trolls usually carried. All this being said, they were still much taller than the 13-year-old Eugene. Eugene slowly readied his shield as he approached the troll. I've beaten both orcs and goblins, but this will be my first time facing a medium to large monster in this body. Just because it was an illusion without a tangible form, he didn't have any intention of fighting carelessly. Even if it wasn't the real thing, his body had been itching for a good fight. Although quite some time had passed since he'd entered the labyrinth, and he thought that he had made a good amount of progress, having come this far, he had yet to feel any sense of danger. That was why he needed to warm up his body a bit. Eugene slowly and obviously narrowed the distance between him and the troll. Across from him, the troll simply blinked its large eyes at Eugene instead of attacking him right away. This wasn't something to be confused about. He had already experienced this several times during his exploration. The monsters in this labyrinth did not attack unless someone stepped within a certain range of them. This should probably be a safety measure placed in consideration for the ages of the participating children. Slowly, just as Eugene's foot was inching forward, the troll's movements suddenly changed. The troll spun its body around and twisted its head towards Eugene as saliva dripped down from between its tusks. It had a face so ugly it could scare, no, terrify children. However, instead of fear, Eugene felt happiness. As I've always said, they looked just like Molan. Though the truth was that more than one monster resembled Molan. Things like trolls, ogres, cyclops, and so on. Basically, any ugly humanoid monster that walks on two legs. Eugene believed that all of these monsters really bore a striking resemblance to Molan. Molan had never been able to conclusively deny this fact. After all, he was well aware of how ugly he was. As Eugene recalled the ugly face of his old comrade, he kicked off the ground. It was only after the distance between them had shrunk in an instant that the troll finally showed a reaction. This showed that it was both clumsy and dull. That was why it was easy for Eugene to do what he did next. Flash. Eugene's sword sliced through the troll's calf as he slid between its legs. Once on the other side, Eugene quickly got back to his feet and turned to face the troll's back. Then, without any hesitation, he swung his sword down at the back of the troll's knee. These injuries would have been light for a real troll. But as expected, these illusions weren't exactly the same as the real thing. Besides, the blade that Eugene was holding wasn't a real, sharp-edged sword either. All of which made the sharp cuts it inflicted on the troll seem quite unreal. Nevertheless, the sword flashed out with one blow after another. As each slash landed where the previous blow had fallen, Eugene finally managed to sever the troll's leg at the knee. Dark green blood spurted out of the wound. Eugene didn't allow any of it to land on him as he covered his face with his shield. However, his heightened senses didn't miss the moment when the troll finally reacted. As it tried to balance its now unsteady body, the troll let out a scream, and one of its large hands swung down at Eugene's head. Eugene's shield, which had been covering his face, shifted upwards. Screech. Compared to the lightness of his own slashes, the troll's attack was extremely heavy. Although his 13-year-old body had been tempered through intense training, it was impossible for him to block the troll's blow head-on. That was why he allowed it to flow to the side. He used both a tilt in the angle of his shield and the full strength of his shoulder and arm as a support. So the descending fist struck the shield at an oblique angle and slid right off. If his timing had been even a little bit off, his arm could have been crushed, but Eugene had never even bothered to doubt himself for a moment. His parrying truly was perfectly executed. With one leg already severed at the knee, the troll's gigantic body lost all balance when its fist slammed into the ground. The troll wildly swung its other arm at Eugene as it tried to stay upright, but Eugene deftly swung the sword that he was still holding in his other hand. Chop chop chop. Blood spurted out as the skin on the troll's arm was lacerated. As Eugene ducked beneath its flailing blows, he reversed his grip on his sword. Squelch. Having already lost one leg at the knee, the troll's other heel was now pinned to the ground by Eugene's sword. Even if it was an illusion, it still reacted realistically to the pain from its wounds. The troll's jaws snapped open as it let loose a scream. The agony coursing through its body also momentarily paralyzed the troll. Was there really a need to copy its bad breath as well? As Eugene felt some displeasure at this thought, he swung his shield. Bang! The shield slammed up into the troll's lower jaw, which was hanging wide open, and slammed it shut. At the same time, he pulled out the sword that he had stuck into the troll's heel and shoved it back in between the troll's ribs. Karg! The troll roared as its breath was driven out of it. Eugene had pierced the troll's lungs. It might be because of how large its torso was, but he couldn't quite thrust his sword clean through the troll's back. Though he hadn't expected to do so in the first place. Eugene continued slicing his sword along the lines of the troll's ribs. By doing so, he completely tore apart its lungs, and then he drew his sword out the moment it touched the sternum. This left the troll without any strength to swing its arms, and it coughed out bloody foam as it gasped for air. If this had been a normal monster, the fight would have ended here. However, trolls were famous for their strong regenerative powers. Eugene was curious to see if this illusory troll actually shared this trait, but he had no intention of allowing it to live a moment longer for the sake of such pointless speculation. As such, Eugene decided to completely neutralize the troll as a threat. Though he had already pushed it to the point that it could no longer offer any resistance, with just a little more effort he could break down the troll's body completely. Eugene thrust his sword into its heart about 5 or 6 times, and then he stabbed it in the neck. Even though he kept swinging his sword so violently, he never once got his blade caught on any bone. Phew! After he had painstakingly finished dismantling the troll, Eugene walked past its corpse with a satisfied expression on his face. Lovelian and Gilead had watched this whole scene take place from beginning to end. Lovelian, whose jaw had dropped open in blank surprise, wondered what sort of remark he should make in response to this. Even if it was all an illusion, that was still a troll. Someone who wasn't even from the main family, a 13-year-old child at that, had, without letting out any sound of surprise upon seeing a troll, proceeded to overwhelmingly tear it to pieces. Wow, that was brutal. I don't think there was a need to go that far. Lovelian muttered probingly. He was trying to feel out Gilead's reaction to this surprise. Gilead had been looking at the screen with similarly shocked eyes and immediately burst out laughing with a shake of his head as a response to Lovelian's words. Your illusions are so well made that they need to be treated as if it were a real battle, isn't that so? Gilead defended Eugene. That might be the case, but... Lovelian hesitated. It's amazing. Very amazing. He shouldn't have faced a troll before, but... rather than stiffening in fear, he cleanly and confidently neutralized the troll as a threat. Gilead couldn't find any flaws in Eugene's swordsmanship. If he had to point something out, it would be that Eugene's performance was closer to slaughtering and butchering an animal than it was to pure swordsmanship. However, what does that have to do with anything? No matter how it was done, Eugene had impressively slain the troll with just his sword. He also hasn't had any difficulties with exploring the labyrinth. Lovelian lavished in amazement as he watched Eugene. Except for the first time, he's never once been caught in a trap. If you just look at his actions, it would seem as if he was familiar with labyrinths, observed Gilead. Where is that boy's hometown? It's in Jidal province. There shouldn't be any ruins there. How remarkable. Most labyrinths were originally created as lairs by wizards. Then sometimes, after the wizard who created the labyrinth had either died or left, these labyrinths were discovered by adventurers. If they were lucky, these adventurers might even find a treasure in the labyrinth. Once everything that hadn't been nailed down was taken as loot, the now treasureless labyrinth would be transformed into a potential tourist destination. Well, it's not like he needs to have delved inside labyrinths all that often. He might have learned how to do it from books. Gilead offered an alternate explanation. Normally, a 13-year-old wouldn't spend time reading a book about labyrinths, Lovelian refuted. But you can't consider that boy a normal child, can you? Also, if he's not relying on knowledge or experience, that means that he could only be depending on his senses. Although it is a labyrinth made with children in mind, to navigate it by his senses. I shouldn't have made it so easy, that he could simply rely on his senses to get through. Lovelian pondered doubtfully. No matter how much of a child he is, as long as he was born with impressive talent, wouldn't it make sense for him to show such a performance? Gilead asked convincingly. Even Lovelian had to admit that was true, and he knew exactly what such a child should be called. A genius. Gilead no longer kept his eyes on Cyan, Seal and Uad. Instead, he watched with delight as Eugene headed towards the center of the labyrinth. When encountering monsters in a labyrinth, fighting them head-on and defeating them in order to get past wasn't always the correct answer. The trolls in this labyrinth were one such example. With their huge bodies that made it inconvenient for them to move quickly and their slow reactions. Rather than an unskippable fight, they should instead be seen as a trap that required you to look for an opening to slip past. The only two who had dared to fight the troll were Gargith and Eugene. Ew! Gargith let out a fierce roar. Although he hadn't made it out of the fight intact, the courageous Gargith had finally defeated the evil troll. Gargith pulled out his greatsword that was lodged in the troll's chest and released another yell. With these roars he celebrated his victory and his continued survival. But then he lost all of his remaining strength and had to slump down on top of the troll. It looks like I took too many hits. Although Gargith might be proud of his muscles, the troll's attacks were just that powerful. He thought that a few of his bones might even be broken. It hurts. Gargith spat out from between gritted teeth. It hurt even more than when he had been struck by arrows or when he had collided with that rolling iron ball. Although he knew that all these pain signals were a trick of magic, painful things were still painful. Holding back the stinging tears, Gargith rolled off the troll's body and onto his feet. Then while holding onto the wall for support he started staggering forward. Since I've received such injuries, the others might also be. He knew that Desra was strong and that Eugene was even stronger than her. However, they shouldn't be stronger than a troll. How could their fragile bodies contend against such a massive troll? In contrast to all his worries, Desra was completely fine. Without facing the troll head-on, she had instead found a gap in its attacks and had successfully slipped past the troll. That went for Cyan and Seal as well. Cyan and Seal had actually met up along the way. Since then, Seal had refused to take the lead and had instead secretly persuaded Cyan to open up the way. It had actually been very easy for her to do so. "Brother, which path should we take?" Seal had asked. "Can't you even tell that?" Cyan said with a disdainful look. "I'm not really sure. This idiot, we both read the same book, so how could you not know? Just watch me." Cyan had never once felt inferior to his younger sibling, Seal, who was born a few seconds later than he was. Instead, while believing that he should be a role model to his sister, he never missed a chance to show off in front of her. That applied to the current situation as well. From the moment that the words "not short" had passed his sister's lips, Cyan had decided that it was an opportunity to put on a superior act in front of his younger sister. Since he had just been humiliated a few days ago right in front of her eyes, he thought that now was the time to restore his tarnished image. "Don't fall behind and follow me closely. This is a labyrinth created by the head wizard of the Red Tower after all," Cyan ordered. "Why does that matter?" Seal asked naively. "That means we can never know what might happen. A monster might even suddenly appear in front of us. Or else something strange might fall down from the ceiling. Something like a ghost? Idiot, at a time like this you should be wondering about the undead, not ghosts. Do you know what the undead are? They're things like zombies and ghouls, right?" "That's right. It was mentioned in the book that we read together about the labyrinth made by the evil Black Wizard. It became the grave of any foolish adventurers blinded by the treasure. It said that the Black Wizards of the olden days would make undead minions and chimeras from the adventurers who died in their labyrinths. But the head wizard of the Red Tower isn't a Black Wizard. That might be the case, but you never know. The undead might show up as some form of illusion." "I hate ghosts since they're scary," Seal confessed. "I'm not afraid of anything," Cyan boasted. To tell the truth, Cyan was also scared of ghosts. When he was very young, back when the twins shared the same room, they were looked after by a nanny who read them all sorts of stories every night. Sometimes, when their nanny would read them a scary story, Cyan wouldn't be able to fall asleep all throughout the night as he vainly tried to keep an eye on the space beneath his bed and inside his closet. However, he could not expose such a shameful fear in front of his younger sister. Why did she have to start talking about ghosts all of a sudden? Cyan thought to himself as he suppressed the tremors in his body and kept glancing up at the ceiling. Like something strange he had imagined falling from the ceiling was, at most, a spider or some other kind of monster. He hadn't even considered ghosts. Naturally, Seal had brought up the topic of ghosts deliberately. She knew very well that her brother had been scared of ghosts ever since they were young, and she wanted to tease her brother, who kept strutting arrogantly as he forged ahead. "It would be fun if something showed up to startle my brother," Seal thought mischievously as she trailed behind Cyan. At some point, forks had stopped appearing on the road. However, that didn't mean the road just kept heading straight. Instead, it began to bend this way and that as the different paths started to join together. Each time this happened, Cyan was filled with caution at the thought that something might come popping out from around the corner. Since her brother didn't end up screaming soon like she had hoped, Seal slowly began to grow bored. She wondered if she should just poke him in the back. If she did, Seal thought that her brother might make quite an amusing sound of surprise. When would be the best time for that? Since her brother had his guard up for now, she needed to wait until he was almost fully relaxed. "Brother, do you think that Eugene is still in the labyrinth?" Seal asked. "The son of a bitch is someone who defeated me. There's no way he'll be taken down by monsters or traps," Cyan reluctantly admitted. "But there's a possibility that he might have gotten caught in a trap. Among all the traps that I saw, there was one that was almost a bottomless hole. If he got caught in that, wouldn't he be unable to get out?" "It's possible," Cyan nodded his head with a solemn expression on his face. "Thanks to our mother, we learned a lot about labyrinths before we entered, but the others probably weren't able to do that. Especially Eugene, since he's such a country bumpkin, he probably didn't even know what a labyrinth was. But it would be fun if we could all meet up in the center." "Hey, what would be fun about that? Those guys are our competition." "But didn't father say that there was no real need to fight and compete against each other?" At these words, Cyan pursed his lips. Finally, he said, "He might have said that, but he also didn't say that we weren't allowed to fight. So if I end up meeting with a certain someone, then I'm going to fight them. Do you think you'll win? I lost back then because I got cocky. If we fight again, then I will definitely win." "Really?" "F for sure." Although that was what he said, Cyan couldn't be certain of his victory. He remembered how much it had hurt when Eugene had struck him, as well as the cold look in his eyes. His body almost started trembling uncontrollably. It might have been because of the earlier talk of ghosts already putting him on edge, but he needed to focus even more to keep himself from trembling. "Don't say anything unnecessary, Seal," Cyan spat out as he turned to look at Seal. Seal stuck out her tongue at him and just smiled. With one final look at his sister, Cyan turned towards the front and said, "I need to org." Just as they rounded a corner, a woman covered in bloodstains suddenly appeared out of a side tunnel. Cyan's eyes widened and his pupils shrank as he cut off his words in a scream. "Kaya!" came a returning cry. From inside the side tunnel, Desra had been listening to the sound of approaching conversation. She had realized that it was Cyan and Seal, two of her competitors in the bloodline continuation ceremony. She was thinking of surprising them with an ambush if they had negligently let their guards down, but Desra was the one who ended up startled by Cyan's loud cry, and she had let loose with her own scream in return. "Bark! Whack!" As their two cries mixed with each other, Seal grabbed her stomach and burst out laughing at this sight. After screaming like this for some time, Cyan finally returned to his senses and instead drew his sword. "Desra, you dare attempt to startle me?" Cyan demanded. "I'm the one who was startled." Desra defended herself. Desra was younger than Cyan. On top of that, since she came from a collateral line, she just couldn't feel confident speaking with Cyan. So instead she jumped slightly and took a few steps back. Her ambush was a total failure. "Why would I startle you? And you, what's with your look? You're dressed like that because you wanted to jump out and scare me," Cyan said angrily. "This is because I got hurt. Don't lie to me." Desra felt like she was about to burst something from the injustice of his accusation. She had to get past all kinds of traps, monsters, and a giant troll just to get this far. No matter how precocious Desra was for her age, slight wounds were unavoidable. The reason for her blood-stained face was that she had grazed her forehead on the way here. "I can't forgive you. You dared to startle me. Did you really think I wouldn't know what you were planning? You were planning on ambushing us after you surprised us, right?" Cyan barked. "No, I wasn't." He had actually hit upon the truth, but Desra hadn't even gotten a chance to attempt her plan before it was already ruined. Desra groaned in frustration and turned around. Then she started running away at full speed. "Brother, she's running away. She dares." Cyan was genuinely angry. He had been made to scream in an unsightly manner in front of his younger sister. Desra was truly mean-spirited to have leaped out at him while pretending to be a ghost. It was even more hateful than Eugene's surprise attack. That was why he definitely couldn't forgive her. Cyan started chasing after Desra. Seal also followed behind Cyan, still giggling. No matter how long and agile Desra's limbs were, she couldn't be faster than the twins, who had already started training their mana. The distance between them gradually narrowed. Desra desperately wondered, "Where's that son of a bitch Gargith gone to?" "Gargith!" Desra screeched loudly. However, at that moment, Gargith was in the middle of roaring out his victory on top of the downed troll, so he couldn't hear Desra's call. "Don't run away," Cyan demanded. "I haven't done anything wrong," Desra protested. "Then why are you running away?" "Because you want to bully me." "You're right. I do," Cyan exclaimed. At this reply, Desra squeezed out even more strength. Could she have tried fighting back instead? If Cyan was on his own, that might have been a possibility, but he had Seal with him as well. Besides, with her body covered in wounds, she definitely couldn't win. But Eugene might be able to, Desra recalled. But where was that bastard? While running headlong, Desra accidentally stepped on the trigger to a trap. Boom. The floor ahead completely collapsed downwards. With a scream of surprise, Desra leaped off the ground. Bang bang. Desra just barely managed to jump over the hole and landed on her ass on the other side. While holding onto her sore tailbone, Desra sobbed in pain. "That's why I told you not to run." Cyan immediately halted in front of the sudden trap and shouted across to her. Desra panted as she tried to catch her breath, before eventually taking off running once more. "Brother!" Seal cried as she caught up. Cyan looked down into the trap for a moment. It was so deep that he couldn't even see the bottom. On top of that, the other side of the trap was really far away. Cyan dithered for a moment out of hesitation. Should he go back and find another path instead? Just as he was about to turn back, he saw the look of expectation in his sister's eyes. Cyan bit down on his lip firmly. He could no longer show her such an embarrassing side of himself. "Ayah!" Cyan vaulted over the trap with a scream. The mana flowing through his body easily allowed him to leap over that great distance. "Seal, you should jump too. I'll catch you." "Yeah." With reassuring eyes, Cyan spread his arms wide. However, Seal simply leaped over the trap and landed beside him on the other side without needing Cyan's help at all. The twins had had the same lessons ever since they were young. If Cyan could do it, then of course Seal was able to do it as well. As expected from my little sister. After awkwardly lowering his outstretched arms, Cyan resumed his pursuit of the escaping Desra. But the twins were stopped before they got too far. Ahead of them, Desra had stopped as well. "It's the boss monster," one of them whispered. At the conclusion of their fierce race, the three had actually managed to reach the center of the labyrinth. At the end of their path lay a huge underground cave with walls on all sides. In the center of the cave sat a monster which was even larger than a troll. "Why are the three of you together?" Sitting with his back against the wall, Eugene tilted his head to the side and asked the new arrivals. "What are you doing here?" Cyan asked, snapping out of his astonishment. "What am I doing? Can't you see that I'm just sitting?" "But why here?" "I was interested to see who'd be arriving first." Eugene laughed as he gave this reply. His round, wide eyes were overflowing with mischievous playfulness. "Who'd be arriving first?" Cyan's expression twisted as he repeated. He felt like Eugene's words were meant to mock him. After all, the one who had broken through the labyrinth and arrived at the center first was definitely Eugene. Desra was the first to arrive, Eugene decided. But she was just running away. Cyan protested. Why was she running away? This was a question that Cyan absolutely couldn't bear to answer. This had all begun because he had mistaken Desra's blood-stained appearance for a ghost and had let out a scream. Then, embarrassed and angered by this, he had decided to catch her and teach her a lesson. If he were to try and explain all of this, Cyan felt that he would first have to admit to Eugene that he had screamed because he was afraid of ghosts. To me, she insulted me. With some difficulty, Cyan came up with this excuse. "You really do like to use the word insult a lot," Eugene observed. "When did I ever insult you, Cyan?" Desra shouted with a resentful expression on her face. If only she had managed to ambush them as planned, then at least this abuse would be justified. Cyan was the one who overreacted. "We just happened to meet up on the same path." Desra continued her explanation. "You deliberately startled me," Cyan accused her. "That's not how it happened. Instead, I'm the one who got startled by your scream." Desra refuted. I didn't scream," Cyan lied as he clenched his fists and his ears were dyed red. "I was just..." I was just yelling because I was so angry. As for you, right? Desra, you were trying to ambush us. No, I wasn't, Desra attempted to deny. You just hesitated for a moment, didn't you? I saw your eyes waver. So you really were planning to ambush us. How dare a collateral descendant like you try to attack someone like me? Ah geez. I fucking said that I wasn't. Desra shouted loudly, feeling both embarrassed and victimized. Cyan's eyes widened in shock at this explosive shout that exposed some of Desra's usual foul-mouthness. How dare you swear at me? Not only am I the scion of the main family, but I also happen to be a year older than you. I told you that I didn't do any of that, but you keep fucking accusing me. Again with the swearing. Stop, Eugene ordered, having had enough of listening to their childish quarrel. In the first place, he hadn't the slightest interest in whatever insult Cyan may have perceived. Whatever happened, Desra was the first to arrive, Eugene stated once more. Weren't you the first to arrive? Seal asked with a grin. That's right, I did arrive here first, Eugene easily admitted. Just what is it that you want to say? Desra asked as she glanced sideways at Eugene. They had talked about a plan to combine their strengths to defeat the boss monster on the night they had met in Eugene's room, following their dinner with the Lionheart Patriarch. Could the reason he was waiting here for them be that Eugene had challenged the boss monster on his own and failed? I just thought that I should concede this chance to all of you, Eugene said with a smile. Concede? Desra asked. The thing is, I can fight with him and I'll probably win. But if I just went and nabbed him first, I'd feel sorry for you lot who worked so hard to get here. What the hell do you think you're saying? Cyan roared loudly in anger. He was definitely insulting all of them by saying this. Although Desra wasn't shouting like Cyan was, she glared at Eugene with a frown. As for Seal, she wasn't feeling at all angry or insulted. Instead, she found this situation so highly entertaining that she was on the edge of her seat as she waited to see what happened next. To be fair, let's go in order of arrival, Eugene said, ignoring their outrage. Are you really in your right mind? How many times were you struck in the head by monsters on your way here? Cyan questioned. I didn't get hit at all. I'm perfectly fine, Eugene reassured Cyan as he looked over to Desra without getting up from his seat. If you don't think you can win, feel free to give up. It's your right to do so after all. Visit for a better user experience. Give up? Desra furrowed her brows. She had gone through so much just to get here. His talk about a concession was already absurd enough, but when he told her to give up, Desra really felt infuriated. I'm not going to give up, Desra shouted. But it will be difficult for you on your own. Eugene smiled teasingly. As her shoulders shook in anger, Desra turned to look at the boss monster standing in the central cave. Even from this distance, Desra could clearly see that the boss monster had a tough, muscular build. It was even bigger than the troll that she had barely managed to escape from earlier. Its most distinctive characteristic was its head. The boss monster was a giant humanoid with the head of a bull. In other words, a minotaur. It was a monster that almost always appeared in the many stories involving labyrinths. However, seeing the minotaur in reality, it didn't appear anywhere near as ridiculous as it sounded in fairy tales. Desra gulped as she stared at the minotaur's twin pair of gigantic horns. Why hasn't Gargith, that son of a bitch, arrived yet? The original plan was to join forces with Gargith to fight the boss monster. However, Gargith seemed to have gotten stuck somewhere as he showed no signs of arriving anytime soon. Just in case, Desra shot Eugene a look. I'm only going to fight after you all have had your chances, Eugene insisted. You really are crazy, aren't you? Desra hissed. Cyan was so perplexed that for a few moments he had just kept listening as they talked. However, he couldn't hold it in any longer. Do you really think that you'll get a turn? Cyan demanded. Yeah, I think I will, Eugene replied confidently. Don't bullshit me. Do you really believe that I won't be able to defeat a single cow-headed bastard? If you do defeat it, I'll acknowledge you as my big brother for the rest of my life. At these words, Cyan hesitated for a moment. He imagined being able to hear this cheeky bastard call him older brother for the rest of his life. The childish Cyan found this proposal extremely attractive. Don't go back on your words later. Don't worry, I won't. After hearing Eugene's confirmation, Cyan dropped down on the spot. Then, as he slowly breathed in and out, he began absorbing mana into his body. Since he had used up a lot of strength just getting here, he needed to quickly restore his mana through this method. If it's a minotaur. Truthfully, this was also Cyan's first time seeing one in real life. However, he had read many stories about minotaurs in the books he had been perusing at random for the past few days. It was a monster without any particular weaknesses, but it also didn't have any specific strengths. It had its strength and its tough skin, but these were natural features for a medium to large monster of that size. It didn't have the strong regenerative capabilities of a troll, nor did it have the unspeakable strength and fury of an ogre. It was of moderate strength and intelligence. The Minotaur, as seen through Cyan's eyes, was a monster that could be beaten without much difficulty. However, Desra got a completely different feeling from it. Calming her shaking heart, she hesitantly made her way out into the central cave. Both her spear and the hands holding it were shaking. Although she had hunted many monsters around the same level as orcs, she had yet to hunt a monster as large as the Minotaur. They say that Minotaurs are higher up on the food chain than trolls, but this wasn't always necessarily the case. But for now, she would accept the fact that Minotaurs were of similar or greater strength to trolls. Desra, who had slipped past her troll without having been able to defeat it, found it impossible to imagine how she might be able to achieve victory. Hiya! That said, she couldn't just turn back after having come this far. Desra shouted a battle cry to still her fear. Then she tightened her grip on her spear and charged at the Minotaur. Before Desra could close the distance, the Minotaur got to its feet. It showed an unbelievable speed of reaction for such a heavy creature. Even trolls weren't that fast, and its figure as it got up onto its feet was far larger than the average troll. The Minotaur turned its head towards Desra. The cattle eyes that Desra was familiar with were normally bright and cute, but the Minotaur's eyes were full of eerie light. The Minotaur swung its hand and with a cry, Desra thrust her spear. Crack! The Minotaur's large hand shattered her spear into pieces without any apparent difficulty. But they said that it wouldn't break. Desra's face twisted in betrayal. The Minotaur quickly raised its hand once more and slammed it down on top of Desra's head, but this was still within the limits of Desra's ability to react. She leaped to the side, dodging the attack, and then swung the end of her broken spear at the Minotaur's exposed flank. Fuck. Although the blow landed, the attack made using such unstable footing didn't prove very effective. Without making even a single grunt of pain, the Minotaur caught up to Desra. Kaya! Its large fingers completely wrapped around her body. Desra screamed fearfully as she tried desperately to escape. Her intuition was honestly telling her that she was about to die. Could this all really be an illusion? No, it was impossible. Desra closed her eyes tightly in the face of her impending doom. However, the Minotaur didn't inflict any of the terrible endings that Desra had imagined on her. It didn't crush her body through its forceful grip, nor did it dash her against the ground. Instead, it simply threw her at the entrance of the path leading into the center of the labyrinth. Screech! Desra was so consumed by fear that she forgot her training to deal with falls. So after skidding across the ground, she just lay where she fell, whimpering in pain. Her whole body was aching after having flown so far through the air before falling, and it felt like she had broken several bones. Since you've lost, get back out of the way, Eugene ordered. It hurts. Desra cried out piteously. Well, of course it would hurt, Eugene pointed out without sympathy. Why did it just stop at throwing her? Seal asked, her face showing incomprehension. Although it wasn't like she wanted to see such a brutal scene taking place right in front of her, no matter how much Seal thought about it, the Minotaur's behavior just now didn't seem like something a monster would do. That's because that thing over there isn't a real monster, Eugene replied dismissively. There's no reason why it has to kill us, since the moment it gets its hands on us, we've already lost. The organizers of this ceremony also had no reason to want to truly traumatize the young children. Having watched this situation play out, Cyan got up with a relaxed smile on his face. Humph. Instead of rushing out first, you should have recognized your place. Did you really think that you'd be able to defeat a Minotaur? Desra was unable to respond, and she could only sob and curl her aching body into a ball. Cyan smirked as he stalked past Desra into the center of the labyrinth. What a fool. Just sit there and keep your eyes peeled wide open as I show you how it's meant to be done. I'll prove once for all that the blood of the main family is on a different level to a collateral descendant like yourself. Cyan felt like he had to compliment himself on such a magnificent speech. Of course, these words weren't just meant for Desra. They were aimed at Eugene as well. However, Eugene was simply smiling in amusement, as if he saw something funny that Cyan had missed. Bastard. Does he really think that I can't kill a cow-headed bastard like that? Cyan drew his sword with an eye-catching flourish. Then he began focusing his concentration on his sword. As he did so, the mana circulating through his body began flowing into the sword as well. Sword light. Desra felt a huge shock hit her. A faint light had wrapped itself around Cyan's sword. That was definitely sword light, something that could only be manifested once your mana had been trained to a certain level. Desra personally knew just how powerful a light like that was. It was basically a blade of mana that could cut through anything it touched. She had sometimes seen her father wrap the spear equivalent of sword light around his spear and use it to pierce through a large block of iron as if it were a piece of tofu. If you train hard once you return from the bloodline continuation ceremony, you'll also be able to manifest sword light, her father had told her before she left for the main house. In order to activate the slightest ray of sword light, you needed to have trained your mana for at least 10 years. However, Cyan was only 1 year older than her and could already manifest his sword light. This fact frustrated Desra greatly. Haha. Cyan laughed as he came out of his focus. Cyan enjoyed seeing Desra in shock. Unfortunately, he couldn't maintain the sword light for very long with the amount of mana that he possessed. However, it wouldn't take him very long to slice this stupid cow-headed bastard into pieces. With a confident gait, Cyan approached the Minotaur. However, before he had taken much more than a few steps, Cyan halted in his tracks. The mana that composed the sword light had suddenly scattered. Cyan looked at his sword in confusion. He tried to focus his mind once more on emitting the sword light, but no matter how much mana he used, he couldn't stop the sword light from scattering into the air. What the? Eugene looked at Cyan's bewildered appearance with a playful light in his eyes. While it had been a surprise to see that Cyan already knew how to manifest his sword light, the fact that he knew how to do this only made Eugene even happier. A faint magic circle was drawn on the walls surrounding the central cave, so faded that you needed to look very closely to see it. Eugene had recognized the appearance of this magic circle. Although several points seemed to have been changed, the basic gist of it still remained. This was a magic circle that cut off all use of mana within its range. 300 years ago, Sienna had used this very same magic circle to counter several demonic wizards. Who'd have thought that they would install this kind of magic circle in the center of the labyrinth? Since the collateral descendants hadn't trained their mana, this magic circle's only targets were the children of the main family. Well, he did say that he would be judging us on the qualities that we had inherited, not the concentration of our blood. Gilead was the one who had said this, and he had really put his words into action. Usually, the collateral descendants would never be able to win against the children of the direct line. However, what if the children of the main family could no longer use mana? Not knowing what to do, Cyan hesitantly backed away. The Minotaur simply stood idly by and watched Cyan as he did so. Just what on earth is going on? Why isn't the sword light activating? Even though I still have plenty of mana. Brother. Seal called out to Cyan. Cyan's shoulders twitched at the sound of her voice. Could he really defeat the Minotaur without the use of sword light? Cyan gulped. He couldn't even absorb any more mana into his body. That meant he wouldn't be able to maintain the boost to his physical strength for very long. Did he really have a chance? If you think you're going to lose, then just come back. Don't pointlessly get your ass beaten out of stubbornness, Eugene called out as he snickered. That irritating voice. Cyan bit down firmly on his lips. He had nowhere to retreat. If he admitted that he couldn't do it and just turned back now. Hiya! Letting loose a loud roar, Cyan charged at the Minotaur. Like the last time, the Minotaur only started moving after Cyan had rushed in. Although he couldn't call up his sword light, Cyan's movements were incomparably faster than Desra's had been. The Minotaur swung its hand. Cyan avoided the Minotaur's hand and dived into its reach with great difficulty. Then with all his strength he swung his sword. Clang! Cyan's sword sliced at the Minotaur. However, this only left a shallow cut on the monster's skin. While enduring the pain in his wrists from the recoil, Cyan continued to fiercely swing his sword. Cyan was extremely desperate. As he narrowly escaped the Minotaur's attacks by dodging here and there, he continued to slash and stab with his sword. However, none of his attacks were truly injuring the Minotaur. It was incomparably stronger than all the monsters he had faced up until now. The leg. I need to hit its leg. Cyan's breathing was already strained. Having inflicted only shallow wounds so far, he was far from defeating the monster. He needed to make a decisive attack. For starters, it was just way too large, so he needed to bring it down somehow. But his thoughts didn't have the time to form properly. Watch out for its hand. Cyan quickly ducked his head. Then as he dived forward with his head down, he thrust his sword at the Minotaur's knee. Crack. Unfortunately, he had gotten the angle of the stab wrong. Cyan's sword didn't pierce into the Minotaur's joint as he had hoped, and instead, as it impacted with the Minotaur's tough kneecap, the sword cracked into pieces. As he saw this happen, Cyan's eyes filled with tears of despair. But they said it wouldn't break. The moment his sword broke, Cyan resentfully complained to Lovelian in his head, just as Desra had done. Unfortunately, what followed next was also identical to Desra's experience. The Minotaur's large hand wrapped around Cyan and threw him towards the entrance. Hurg. Fortunately, Cyan was able to control his fall to minimize the damage. However, he was thrown so far and his body was so exhausted that he wasn't able to fully mitigate the force of the throw. Coming out of his roll, Cyan writhed on the ground as he tried to grab at his throbbing back. Gah! He groaned. You lost as well, Eugene teased Cyan with a chuckle. Cyan couldn't say anything in reply, so he could only bite his lips in shame. I'm not going to fight, Seal blurted out immediately. His sword light wasn't working because of that, right? Seal's finger pointed at the magic circle that had been inscribed on the walls. Oh, Eugene exclaimed inwardly impressed. Looks like she really did have better eyes than her brother. How should I know? Eugene said with a smile as he stood up. After looking at her brother with eyes that showed a mix of worry and amusement, Seal turned back to Eugene. Can you win? She asked him. I'll have to give it a try, he said, and with this reply, Eugene walked out to meet the Minotaur. Although he may have spoken modestly, Eugene had no intention of losing.